This mini-lecture introduces the ideal gas law, which combines the relationships seen in the fundamental gas laws from the previous mini-lecture, all into one equation. And we'll talk about what happens when you have a mixture of gases by introducing Dalton's law of partial pressures. In the last mini-lecture, the fundamental gas law relationships between volume, pressure, temperature, and the number of moles of a gas were introduced. These relationships were determined by keeping two of the four variables constant and looking at how the other two variables changed with relationship to one another. Here we see a summary of all of these proportional relationships, and by combining the first three, we get a proportionality statement that relates all four variables to one another. And this gives the basis for the ideal gas law. Also, note that this proportionality statement can be rearranged to give other versions, this second version of which will be useful moving forward. Now, the term ideal in ideal gas law refers to the fact that we will be making a few assumptions about gases that are reasonable considering the relationships that have been previously observed between pressure, volume, temperature, and the number of moles of gas. These assumptions begin by recognizing that under most normal conditions, gas molecules are very far apart from each other, which means that first, the molecules are too far apart to interact, so they won't attract or repel each other. Therefore, we don't need to consider how those interactions might affect their properties because we assume that ideal gases don't interact. Second, the volume of the gas molecules themselves will be very small compared to the container that the gas molecule is contained in. Therefore, the volume of the molecules themselves is negligible and does not affect the overall volume of the gas. This gives us a picture of an ideal gas as a collection of non-interacting particles, where the size of the particles does not affect the relationships between the volume, pressure, temperature, or number of moles of the gas. Therefore, we can assume that any gas can behave like an ideal gas, and that all gases behaving ideally will behave in the same way, regardless of the identity of the gas. So starting from the previous combined equation of all the fundamental gas laws, several experiments on different ideal gases were conducted, and by rearranging this proportional relationship to place all variables on one side, a constant value was observed from experiments on multiple different gases. This constant, R, is called the ideal gas law constant, and there are two different versions of this value, expressed in two different sets of standard units. The one with the gas law's units of pressure and volume will be used in this chapter, and the other version with energy units of joules will be used more in Gen Chem 2 when we discuss energy relationships in chemical reactions, so you can ignore this one for now. Since this constant is observed for all gases displaying ideal behavior, it allows us to finally write the proportionality statement between the gas variables as an actual equation, called the ideal gas law. With this equation, we can calculate the pressure, volume, temperature, or the number of moles of gas for a sample under a specified set of conditions as long as 3 out of the 4 variables are known. While the fundamental gas laws we talked about in the last mini-lecture are useful when conditions are changing from an initial state to a final state, and also in understanding how these properties relate to each other, the ideal gas law is useful for simply calculating the conditions for a given state where the conditions are not changing. Now, another cool thing about the ideal gas law is that we can use it to remember all the fundamental gas laws. For example, if a given situation in a problem has a constant volume and constant number of moles of gas, simply take the ideal gas law and rearrange it so that all the values that are constant are on one side, while the values that are changing are on the other side. Here, the values that are constant are indicated in yellow. Next, we simply recognize that since the right side represents a set of constant values, then the initial state and the final state will always give the same value on the right side. Therefore, the left side of both states can be set equal to each other, resulting in the fundamental law between the variables that are changing. So here, pressure over temperature was the Amonton's or Gay-Lussac's law. Let's look at another one. This time, pressure and temperature are held constant. Starting with the ideal gas law, We rearrange it so that all the values that are constant are on one side, while the values that are changing are on the other side. Then recognize that the initial state and the final state will always give the same value on the right side. Therefore, the left side of both states can be set equal, resulting in the fundamental law between the variables that are changing. So, the only equation you really need is the ideal gas law, as all the other fundamental gas laws can be determined from it. Up until now, we haven't really distinguished between pure samples of gas and a mixture of gases. So let's talk about mixtures. First, recall that the ideal gas law assumes that gas molecules do not interact with each other. So we can make the same assumption with a mixture of gases as long as the gases don't react with each other. Additionally, remember that if the volume and temperature are held constant, that increasing the number of gas particles will lead to an increase in pressure because the pressure and the number of moles of gas are directly proportional to each other. So, we first consider a sample of pure helium. At a constant volume and constant temperature, the sample of helium shown here has a pressure of 200 torr, as indicated by the two 100 torr weights that are being used to balance the pressure of the gas at the top of this diagram. Next, consider a sample of pure argon at the same constant volume and constant temperature as the helium. Note that the containers are the same size. Except in the case of this argon sample, the moles of gas is greater, as indicated by the greater number of red argon molecules compared to the smaller number of blue helium molecules in the figures. Therefore, if the volume and temperature are the same but the number of gas molecules is greater, we expect a greater pressure for the argon, as there are more molecules of gas. This is confirmed by the 5 100 torr weights in the argon figure. So this argon gas sample has a pressure of 500 torr. These two figures on their own clearly demonstrate this direct relationship between the number of gas molecules and the pressure at constant temperature and volume. So remember that this difference in pressure that we're seeing here is not due to the differences in the identity of the gases, but simply the fact that the argon has more molecules of gas. So, when we mix these two samples together, again keeping the volume and the temperature constant, we expect that the number of molecules inside the container is going to increase because now we have both of these samples contained in this container. So therefore, the pressure should increase, as we're seeing down here. In fact, the total pressure of the combined samples of gas is just the sum of the individual partial pressures of the two gases as long as the volume and temperature remain constant. In the mixture, we can also still refer to the partial pressure of these individual gases, and this value will be the same as the pressure of the pure sample of gas. So in the mixture, the blue helium molecules have a partial pressure of 200 torr because the pressure is for the same amount of pure helium that we saw gave a pressure of 200 torr at the same volume and temperature. The presence of the argon in the mixture doesn't affect the properties of the helium because the molecules don't interact. So, when calculating the partial pressure of a gas in a mixture, you only need to consider the total volume that the mixture is contained in, the temperature, and the number of moles of the gas you're interested in. For this mixture, Dalton's law of partial pressures gives the following equation, which states that the total pressure of the mixture is equal to the sum of the partial pressures of the helium and the argon gases. And the ideal gas law tells us that the partial pressure of each gas in the mixture is equal to the moles of gas times the ideal gas constant times the temperature divided by the total volume of the mixture. So we can substitute the ideal gas law for each of the partial pressures. But in the mixture, the only difference between these two expressions is the number of moles of gas, because the temperature and the volume of the two gases is the same. So we can simplify the equation based on algebra rules by factoring out that total volume on the bottom and moving it to the left side of the equation. And we can factor out the ideal gas constant R and temperature, leaving the sum of the moles of gas in parentheses, which just represents the total moles of gas. Now, what this derivation shows is that the total pressure of a mixture can be determined by adding together the partial pressures of the individual gases if they are known or they can be calculated from the ideal gas law, Or the total pressure can be determined by adding together the moles of each gas to determine the total moles of gas, and then just using this value in the ideal gas law to calculate the total pressure. Now, mixtures of gases occur frequently in the lab, most notably when a gas is collected over water, as in the experimental setup shown here. In this figure, the solid is decomposed within a closed container. One of the products of the decomposition is oxygen gas, and as the gas is produced, it will quickly flow through the tube into the basin of water, forming bubbles that are then collected in the inverted container. This container starts out filled with water, but then slowly becomes filled with oxygen gas as it is collected from the reaction. Many students assume that the only gas present in the container is the oxygen gas that is being collected. However, since liquids spontaneously evaporate, even at room temperature, a small amount of liquid molecules evaporate, converting to the gas state, and will now exist as a vapor above the surface of the liquid. So, when the oxygen gas is bubbled through the water, some of the water molecules evaporate, turning into gas molecules. So the collected gas inside the container will actually be a mixture of oxygen and water gas molecules. Since this type of experiment is conducted frequently, the partial pressure of the water molecules above the surface of the liquid, also referred to as the vapor pressure, is well known and dependent on the temperature of the gas. So as long as the temperature is known, the partial pressure of the water molecules can be easily looked up in a table of water vapor pressures and incorporated to correct calculations concerning the product. Finally, the two approaches for calculating total pressure also suggest another mathematical relationship between the moles of each gas and the total pressure. For this, we introduce a new term called the mole fraction, which represents the ratio of the number of moles of a component of a mixture to the total number of moles in the mixture. Mole fraction is given the Greek symbol chi and is another example of a way of expressing concentration since it represents the amount of a component divided by a total representing the mixture. Again, by substituting a rearrangement of the ideal gas law into the mole fraction expression, we first see that the ratio of the moles of the gas to the total moles in the mixture is equal to the ratio of the partial pressure of a gas to the total pressure of the mixture, which means that the partial pressure of a gas in a mixture can be calculated from the total pressure of the mixture times the mole fraction of the gas. This gives yet another route for solving for the partial pressure of gases in a mixture and means that problems involving mixtures of gases will have many different approaches for how to correctly solve the problem. This concludes the third mini-lecture for material from Chapter 11. Please note any questions you may have about this material and how it is utilized to solve problems in the suggested end-of-chapter exercises and the sapling homework for this chapter. Please post any urgent questions on Piazza. I will also take questions on this material during one of our required class meetings, and during that time, we will focus more on problem solving for concepts in this chapter.